sort of my quest is to make emotions be more discussable at work. Emotions are functional. They're doing something in your social interactions. They have a social function. There's a reason why you get anxious. There's a reason why you get angry. And the functions of anger are to draw attention to things that are wrong. That is when anger can be helpful or hurtful. Anger tends to focus our attention on several areas. When goals are blocked, something is getting in the way of something I'm trying to achieve. And you can feel yourself on a highway in the fast lane coming up behind someone slow, right? You immediately kind of feel this anger. How could this person be in my way? Well, this happens a lot, right? You get blocked at work. When goals are obstructed, that's one of the kind of classic times when anger is aroused. Feelings of inequity and justice. So, anger can help focus our feelings on areas that need to be addressed. And I think when anger can be helpful is when they are focused on areas that need attention. And now I'm thinking of, and we could talk about status, but anger in organizations tends to have more positive consequences when lower status people direct them to upper status. That is, when subordinates express their anger, that tends to more often lead to positive consequences than when supervisors expressed anger to subordinates. And part of it is, as a subordinate, you are drawing attention to something that's wrong. And if it is expressed in a way that is somewhat less intense and focused on problem solving, anger can be quite useful in an organization. It gets hurtful on the other side when it's directed to individual's personality, where you're trying to embarrass someone, you're using your anger to be aggressive, and this is again where that power differential is very important. As a boss, as a leader, expressing anger has to be done very carefully. You are watched, right? It's very important how you express that anger. You may want to use anger to inspire others, but it needs to be handled very carefully. My point in this research was opening up anger and showing, and some of my research and many other people started looking at consequences. And you find out about half the time in organizations when people express their anger, they perceive that positive consequences come from this, usually a little more than half, actually. And this goes against sort of the stereotypical view of anger, which goes back to Aristotle and probably before, which said, the only good thing about anger is it's going to stir things up, cause conflict, people aren't going to get along. That's one view of anger, but anger is also important to express and point to when things are wrong. And we could have a lot more discussion on this, but you think about even Martin Luther King and Gandhi, some of the leading lights of people who have made change in our society. A lot of it's driven by anger directed at injustice, or moral anger, sometimes we call it. So you want to think about the times when it is appropriate, it can be helpful.
Mm.
And my contention is, if an organization can have a culture that is open enough so that people do feel that they can express some level of anger, that's, I will argue, more functional than one that completely regulates anger and no one can express anything, because then it could come out in very negative ways, and we could all talk about the ways that that happens. So my basic anger often gets a bad name. It is often conflated with negative outcomes. It's often conflated with aggression, which is very rare, actually. Only about 10% of anger episodes lead to actual some kind of behavioral aspect. So I want to advocate for a bit more openness to anger.
Yeah, wow. That is absolutely fascinating. I had never considered the notion of the difference between if leaders are expressing anger versus if subordinates are expressing it, and what the difference between those things might be. Even that discussion, we don't have the word anger or feeling, the feeling state angry in the ECD, but I'm suddenly imagining if it wasn't there, maybe if it got picked out as a white card, because in our game, Don, when you select the white cards, they're things that you don't want to feel, but you might from time to time. And the from time to time is a really important part there. And that might create the opportunity for people to have a discussion about how I might feel angry from time to time for these reasons. And there's actually an upside to it.
The other aspect of when anger can be functional is what is the culture of the organization? Is it appropriate to express anger? And this is that article you noted, Jeremy, The Message in the Madness. That is, how open in your organization is it for people to express anger? Is there a wide, and we had a graphic of this kind of, is if there's an expression, is some of that allowed, is almost nothing allowed? And I've been in organizations where it's sort of a high politeness culture, I would call it, where everyone's very polite to each other, but they're not giving actual feedback. There's no negative feedback of any kind, whether anger or not. And I think those organizations are very difficult to exchange real information. So the cultural side is the other aspect I would emphasize in terms of when you can have functional outcomes from anger. It depends on the leadership of the organization whether they work on some of these cultural cues and are seeking a particular kind of emotional culture. And I think that's what Segal was getting into with companionate love and some of the other approaches they took to that kind of cultural perspective. That's where you do want people feeling each other, and in a positive way that's directed to functional outcomes for the organization. Um, so I think it's important for you all to, if you kind of, the negative contagion is something you want to be highly aware of, right? As a leader of an organization or a client of an organization, how is this contributing to what the organization's trying to accomplish? Is it taking you away from those goals? I think that's what's critical to look at. And in that, yeah, the article about teams have emotions as well, it was drawing attention to the fact that we had been very individually based, and organizations were beginning to discover that their teamwork generated new emotions that other people hadn't really brought to them. You've done work with sports teams, right? That's another kind of setting where you can get very interesting results talking about the emotion of a team and what that means, and what you think about the effect of the coach at halftime, right? Sort of there's a stereotypical or narrative about, coaches, coaching the basketball team or a cricket team at a period to unlock sort of performance, new performance. That's where they're trying to tap into that team emotion. So I think, and we had one of Segal's mentors, Barry Staw at Berkeley, did a study of halftime speeches by coaches, looking at basketball teams, and was looking at the effect of those, whether if the coach was angry versus friendly versus using inspiration of various kinds. So I think astute managers are reading these kinds of team emotions. I think as a leader, and I know you all work with trainers, this is something, they could get a handle on. What is the emotion of, what is your team emotion? What does it look like? And when they play the game, they get it, some of it, right?
Hmm.
It'd be really interesting, and I think you're already doing some of this research, but to look at statistically how similar do people respond within a team with those emotions, right?
Hmm.
Is there a substantial amount of similarity on some teams, quite a bit of heterogeneity, as we call it, or a lot of differences on other ones where people respond completely differently? That would be very interesting to look at. The taboo part is that people are fearful of sanctions, right? That if I bring up my authentic emotions, first of all, I will be vulnerable. People will understand more about me, and maybe I don't want that. And the other part is, if I really am authentic, if I tell people I really do think you're an idiot, right? I'm in trouble, and there will be sanctions for me. So I think I'm on the side of you all that the fact that you have a game where you're saying, look at these emotion words, or as Michael Sharp talks about, affective labeling. I think that's exactly right. There's a lot of power in naming your emotions, but for many years, and in many organizations still, it's quite taboo to talk about the emotions. That is too personal. And we are all about work here. And I think the work you're doing to open this up and make it okay, that was always my thing, was discussable. Let's make it discussable. It may be a little uncomfortable, and there's going to have to be some guardrails to it. But my contention is it's better to talk about it than have it lurking under the surface.
Many people here will have experienced that idea you've talked about there, the fear, or had that expressed to them. From my experience, it's fear from both the leader, but also fear from the, let's call it the employee or the direct report. The fear from the leader is, what will I find out that I don't want to know
Yeah,
by having this
good point.
conversation? I think that's one that might not be articulated. It might be an inarticulated fear in a sense. It's like, well, if we open this conversation up, what might I learn that I don't
Where is
want to
this
learn?
going to head? Yeah, no,
Where's this
that's
going
right.
to head? Rather than and the rational answer to that is, it's understanding the data points that can help you find opportunity or overcome challenges. That's what Michael Park talked about, the power of expressing or labeling negative emotions at work, how that gives you information you might not have known.
That's right.
But then I think it's such a beautiful reaffirmation or affirmation of the idea of the fear that I have as an employee, that if I share something personal, that how will I be, what's the repercussions of that? I think that definitely exists.
I'm going to be way on the caution side on this one, because the potential for surveillance with AI is very high. I mean, the notion of what's called, I was looking in preparation for this, kind of looking at articles going back a little way. I was on AI and emotion. There's been work in this area for quite some time, with a lot of optimism that AI would be able, and machine learning would be able to read human emotions very effectively. I am highly skeptical of this. It can read what we call stereotypical expressions of emotion very well. Um, but you even think about anger. Traditionally, anger is expressed with furrowed brow, sort of physical aspects, action around the eyes, wrinkling of the mouth. So you can. There's been a lot of work. Ekman did a huge amount of work on recognizing anger across cultures, for example. So there's certainly stereotypical expressions of anger and fear, like this. But that's not, on a daily basis, that's not necessarily how people express. People are much more subtle. Before we even get into the cultural differences, going from New Zealand to Japan to US, because we express emotions differently. So I'm highly skeptical of using AI to recognize emotions. My other dream is to, keep ethnography as a key contributor to emotions discussions. So really get inside information on an organization, learn how it works. I still advocate for that approach. And I think the work you do, where you meet clients and go into organizations, I think that's really important work.
Mm.
So I think analyzing data like that is really important. I think there's a lot of power in having people pause and think seriously about their emotions. And I like that it's sort of structured like a, I'm not sure whether you call it a game, but it's not really structured quite like a game, but it feels, it comes with cards, or it has a flow of, here are the steps you take. And I think that then puts people in a framework, that gamification, or that being a game is helpful, right? And then they start realizing, And I played my wife and daughter, both of them. My daughter's an MD and my wife teaches science. So they're more on the science side. I'm more on the humanities side. Let's put it that way. So they were highly skeptical of this whole experience. But by the time they got to putting those cards down and dividing them into piles, they really saw some insights in that. So I thought, and we talked a little bit about this earlier, Jeremy. I think at the outside, it looks quite simple, right? We are going to present to some affect labels, some emotion words. I want to just, see which ones could lead to your success, which I think is an interesting question. Um, so it's simple structure, but I think the insights can be very powerful and it kind of forces people to stop and think about their emotions.